It is doubtful that the gift was innate. For my part, I think it came on him suddenly. In fact, until he was 30 years old, he was a confirmed skeptic with no belief at all in miraculous powers. And here, since it is the most convenient place, I should mention that he was a little man with hot brown eyes, very erect red hair, a moustache with ends that he twisted up, and freckles. His name was George McWhirter Fotheringay, not the sort of name one would associate with miracles. And he was a clerk at Gomshots. He was greatly addicted to assertive argument. And it was while he was asserting the impossibility of miracles that he had his first intimation of his extraordinary powers. This particular argument was being conducted in the bar of the Long Dragon, and Toddy Beamish was providing the opposition with a monotonous but very effective repetition of the phrase, "So you say," that drove Mr. Fotheringay to the very limits of his patience. There were present also a very dusty cyclist, the landlord, Mr. Cox, and Miss Maybridge, the perfectly respectable and rather portly barmaid of the Long Dragon. Miss Maybridge was standing with her back to Fotheringay, washing glasses. The others were watching him, more or less amused by the present ineffectiveness of the assertive method. "Now, looky here, Mr. Beamish," said Fotheringay. "Let's clearly understand now what a miracle is. It's something contrariwise to the course of nature, yeah? Done by the power of will, something that couldn't happen without being specially willed, right?" "So you say," said Mr. Beamish. Fotheringay appealed to the cyclist, who had hitherto been a silent auditor, and received his assent. "Right then," said Fotheringay, slightly encouraged by this. "It would be a miracle, for instance. That lamp there could not, in the ordinary course of nature, burn upsy downy, could it, Mr. Beamish?" "You say it couldn't." "What? And you do? You say it could?" "No," said Mr. Beamish reluctantly. No, it couldn't." "Very well," said Mr. Fotheringay. "Here comes someone then, me perhaps, and stands here and says to that lamp, collecting all his will, 'You lamp, turn upside down now without breaking and go on burning steady and—'" Hello? It was enough to make anyone say hello. The impossible, the incredible, was manifest to all. The lamp, that prosaic, common old lamp that had for years illuminated the Long Dragon bar, as solid and indisputable a lamp as ever there was hanging, inverted in the air, burning quietly, with its flame pointing down. Fotheringay stood with an extended finger, an open mouth, and tightly knitted brows. The cyclist, who was sitting next to the lamp, ducked and jumped across the bar. Everybody jumped, more or less. Miss Maybridge screamed. For nearly 3 seconds, the lamp remained in midair, and then came a faint cry of mental distress from Fotheringay. "I can't keep it up!" And the lamp flared suddenly, fell against the corner of the bar, bounced aside, smashed on the floor, and went out. Well, Mr. Cox, the landlord, was the first to speak, and his remark, shorn of needless excrescences, was to the effect that Fotheringay was a fool. The general opinion in the bar closely followed the landlord's, and Fotheringay himself was rather inclined to agree with his detractors and offered no opposition to the proposal of his swift departure. He headed home his mind a tornado of perplexity, and it was only when he found himself alone in his little bedroom that he was able to grapple seriously with his memories of the event and ask, what in thunder just happened? He'd removed his coat and boots, and he was sitting on the bed, repeating for the 17th time the text of his defence. I didn't want the confounded thing to turn upside down, when it occurred to him that at the precise moment that he'd said the commanding words, he had inadvertently willed the thing, and that when he'd seen the lamp in the air, he'd felt that it depended upon him to maintain it there, without being clear how this was to be done. And from that, following, I admit, no clear logical path, he decided to conduct an experiment. Feeling rather foolish, he nevertheless collected his mind and, pointing at the candle, said, "Be raised up." In a second, the feeling of folly vanished, for the candle was indeed raised up. It hung in the air for one giddy moment and then fell with a smash onto the toilet table, leaving Fotheringay in darkness. For a time, he just sat there, perfectly still, before finally muttering, "Oh, crikey," and feeling in his pocket for a match. There were none there, so he rose and groped unsuccessfully about the table. He resorted to his coat, none there either, and then it dawned on him. He extended a hand in the dark and said, "Let there be a match in my hand." A light object fell across his palm, and his fingers closed around it. Now, after several ineffectual attempts to light this miraculous object, he discovered that it was in fact a safety match. He threw it away in disgust. Then it occurred to him that he might have willed it lit. He did so, and the next thing he saw was it burning in the middle of his rug. He caught it up hastily, and it went out. His perception of possibilities had enlarged, however, by now. And replacing the fallen candle in the candlestick, he said, "Here, you be lit." And lo, the candle was flaring. Well, his subsequent meditations were severe but confused. I mean, so far as he could tell, it was a case of pure willing. And the nature of his experiences so far disinclined him for any dramatic experiment, at least until he'd considered the extraordinary events of the day. But he cautiously turned a sheet of paper pink and a glass of water green, and he created a rather handsome snail, which he then miraculously annihilated, and he got himself a miraculous new toothbrush. Somewhere in the small hours, he accepted that his willpower must be of a particularly rare and pungent quality. And the perplexity and fear that had followed his first discovery of this, now qualified by no small amount of pride and by vague intimations of advantage. He became aware that the church clock was striking one, and as it did not occur to him that his daily duties at Gomshott's might be miraculously dispensed with, he resumed undressing for bed. As he struggled to get his shirt over his head, however, he was struck with a brilliant idea. "Let me be in bed," he said. And lo, he found himself so. "Undressed," he stipulated. Finding the sheets cold, he added hastily, "and in my nightshirt. No, in a nice, new, soft woolen nightshirt." "Oh, yes," he said with immense enjoyment. "Yes, that's much better. And now, let me be comfortably asleep." He was pensive at breakfast time, wondering whether, in fact, his nocturnal experiences might not be the product of a particularly vivid dream. And at length his mind turned once more to cautious experiments. He had 3 eggs for breakfast that morning. 2 were supplied by his landlady, perfectly good, if a little shoppy. The third, however, was a very large, fresh, and perfect goose egg, laid, boiled to perfection, and served up by his extraordinary willpower. He hurried off to work in a state of profound but carefully concealed excitement. All day he could do no work because of this astonishing new self-knowledge, but this caused him no inconvenience because he made up for it miraculously in the last 10 minutes of the day. And as that day wore on, his state of mind passed from wonder to elation, because as he turned it over in his mind, his gift promised more and more. He made the decision to subtly increase his personal property by unostentatious acts of creation. He called into existence a pair of splendid diamond cufflinks, and then he hastily annihilated them as young Mr. Gomshott came walking across the counting house towards his desk. And he saw quite clearly that the gift required caution and watchfulness in its exercise, but as far as he could judge, the difficulties attending its mastery could be no greater than those that he'd already faced in the study of cycling. And it was that analogy, perhaps, that drove him out after supper into the lane behind the gasworks to rehearse a few miracles in private. Now, there was possibly a a want of originality in his early attempts, because apart from his willpower, Mr. Fotheringay was not a very exceptional fellow. The miracle of Moses's rod came to his mind, but the night was dark and unfavourable to the proper control of large miraculous snakes. Then he recalled the story of Tannhauser. So he stuck his walking stick into the turf that edged the footpath and commanded the dry wood to blossom. The air was immediately full of the scent of roses. His satisfaction was abruptly ended, however, by the sound of footsteps coming towards him. Fearing a premature discovery of his powers, Fotheringay addressed the blossoming stick. "Quickly, go back!" Now, what he meant, of course, was change back, but instead, the stick receded at a considerable velocity along the path and elicited a cry of anger and pain from the approaching person. "Who are you throwing brambles at, eh?" cried a voice. "That got me on the bleeding shin, that did." I'm sorry," said Fotheringay, and caught nervously at his moustache as he saw Constable Winch limping out of the gloom. "What do you mean by it?" "Oh, it's you, is it? The gent what broke the lamp at the Long Dragon?" "I didn't mean anything by it," said Fotheringay.
"Well, what did you do it for then? It hurt me, did that stick? What are you throwing sticks round for anyway?"
"Look here, I'm very sorry, Mr. Winch," said Fotheringay, "but the fact is—"
"What?"
He could think of nothing but the truth. "Well, the fact is, I was working a miracle."
"Working? Oh! Working a miracle, was it? Don't you make me laugh, son, with your silly little conjuring tricks. Assaulting a police officer, that's what you was doing. Now, I'll tell you something for nothing."
But Mr. Winch was not allowed to finish his sentence. Fotheringay, with a gust of irritation, turned on the constable and spoke bitterly. "Oh, look, I've had enough of this. I'll show you a silly little conjuring trick if you want one. Go to Hades, will you? Go on, go to Hades now." The policeman vanished. But Fotheringay performed no more miracles that night, nor did he trouble to see what had become of his flowering stick. Instead, he returned home very quiet and rather frightened, and went straight to his bedroom. "Lord, it's a powerful gift. It's an extremely powerful gift. I wonder what Hades is like." He sat on the bed, taking off his boots, and then, struck by a happy thought, he transferred Constable Winch to San Francisco, and without any more interference with normal causation, he went soberly to bed. The next day, Fotheringay heard two interesting items of news. The first was that someone had planted a most beautiful climbing rose against the elder Mr. Gomshot's private house in Lulborough Road. The second was that the river was to be dragged for the body of Constable Winch. He was abstracted and thoughtful all day and performed no miracles except willing up certain basic meals for Mr. Winch, and the miracle of completing his day's work with punctual perfection in spite of the bee swarm of thoughts that hummed through his mind. Now, Mr. Fotheringay was not a regular chapel goer, but his system of assertive scepticism had been rather shaken. So the following Sunday, he attended the evening service at the chapel, where, oddly enough, Mr. Maydig, who took a certain interest in occult matters, preached about things that are not lawful. Now, the tenor of this sermon threw an entirely new light on Fotheringay's gifts, and he decided to consult the preacher without delay after the service. Mr. Maydig, a lean, excitable man with a remarkably long neck, was gratified at this request for a private conversation from a young man whose carelessness in religious matters was a subject for general remark in the town. He gladly conducted Fotheringay to his study, seated him comfortably, and standing in front of a cheerful fire, requested him to state his business. Well, at first, his guest was a little abashed and found some difficulty in opening the matter. Well, you'll scarcely believe me, Mr. Maydig, I'm afraid, but oh dear, well, I mean, it's very hard. Look, Mr. Maydig, what is your opinion of miracles? Of miracles? Yeah, do you believe, for instance, that some common sort of a person, someone like me perhaps, might have inside him some sort of a twist that made him able to do things by his will. Oh, well, it's possible, I suppose. Something of the sort is perhaps possible. Look, if I might make free with something here, Minister, I think I might show you my sort of experiment. Now, you take that tobacco jar on the table, for instance. What I want to know is whether what I'm going to do with it now is a miracle or not. Mr. Fotheringay. No, please, Mr. Maydig, please, just a moment. He knitted his brows, pointed towards the tobacco jar and said, "Be a bowl of violets." And the tobacco bar did just as it was ordered. Mr. Maydig started violently and then stood, looking from the thaumaturge to the bowl of flowers, saying nothing. Presently he ventured to lean over the table and smell the violets, and they were fresh picked and very fragrant. And he stared at Fotheringay again. How did you do that, sir? Fotheringay pulled his moustache. I willed it. No, I just told it to change, and well, you saw it changed. Now, Mr. Maydig, is that a miracle? Or is it black art? Or what is it? And I mean, what do you think's the matter with me? That's what I want to ask. It is a most extraordinary occurrence. It is a most extraordinary occurrence, yes. On this day last week, I knew no more that I could do things like that than you did. It came on me quite sudden. It's something odd about my will, I suppose. Don't you think, Mr. Maydig? Well, is that the only thing you can do, Mr. Fotheringay? I mean, are there other things besides that? Oh, Lord, yeah, I can do anything. He thought and suddenly recalled a conjuring trick that he'd once seen. Here, he said, pointing at the bowl of violets. Change into a bowl of fish. Oh, no, not that. Blimey. I mean, change into a glass bowl full of water with goldfish swimming in it. That's better. You see that, Mr. Maydig? It's astonishing. I can change it into anything. Here, be a pigeon, will you? And in a moment, a pigeon was fluttering about the room. Stop there! And the pigeon hung, motionless in the air. Now I'll change it back into a bowl of flowers, he said. And after replacing the pigeon on the table, worked that miracle. I expect you'll be wanting your pipe in a bit, he said. And he restored the tobacco jar. Now Mr. Maydig had followed all this in a sort of ejaculatory silence. Now after that, said Fotheringay, it's a bit easier to explain what I come about. And he proceeded to a lengthy narrative of his experiences, beginning with the lamp in the Long Dragon and complicated by persistent allusions to Constable Winch. Then, just as he was dealing with the miracle of the third egg, the minister interrupted him with a fluttering extended hand. No, please. It's quite extraordinary, of course, in itself, but you see, it also reconciles a number of amazing difficulties. That the power of miracles is a gift. It's a peculiar quality. I mean, like second sight. I mean, hitherto it has come very rarely and only to exceptional people. But in this case, you see, I've always wondered at the miracles of Muhammad, the yogi's miracles, the miracles of Madame Blavatsky. But of course, it is simply a gift. And yet here we plumb some profounder law, deeper than the ordinary laws of nature. But I beg your pardon, Mr. Fotheringay. Please carry on. Yeah, well, you see, what troubles me most, Mr. Maydig, what I most immediately want of advice of is what to do about Constable Winch. I mean, of course, he's in San Francisco, wherever San Francisco may be, but it's awkward for both of us, you see, because I don't see how we can understand what's happened to him, and I dare say that he's scared and exasperated, something tremendous. I dare say that he keeps on starting off to come back here and get me, and I send him back, of course, by a miracle every few hours when I think of it. And that's a thing that he won't be able to stand either, you see, and it's bound to annoy him. And you see, if he bought a ticket every time, it would cost him a lot of money.
I mean, I've done the best I could for him, of course, but well, it's difficult to put himself in my place for him. I thought afterwards that his clothes might have got scorched, if Hades is all it's cracked up to be. And in that case, I suppose they'd have locked him up in San Francisco. So I wheeled him a new suit of clothes on directly I thought of it. But you see, I'm already in a deuce of a tangle. Mr. Maydig looked serious. Oh, no, it is undoubtedly a difficult position, but I think that we can leave Constable Winch for the time being and discuss a larger question. You see, I don't think that this is a case of the black art or anything like that, Mr. Fotheringay. Yeah, and I'm sure that there's no taint of criminality about it. No, it's miracles. It's pure miracles. Miracles, if I may say, of the very highest class. He began to pace the hearthrug and gesticulate while Fotheringay sat at the table looking worried. My dear sir, you are a most important man. You are a man of the most astonishing possibilities. He stopped and looked directly at Fotheringay. Let us test your powers, sir. Let us see if they really are all that they seem to be. And so, incredible as it may sound, in the study of that little house behind the Congregational Chapel, on the evening of Sunday, November the 10th, 1896, George McWhirter Fotheringay, egged on and inspired by Minister Maydig, began to work miracles. Now, your attention is called especially to that date. You will object, perhaps, that certain points in this story are improbable. That if any of the things described had actually occurred, then they'd have been reported in the papers at the time, and you'd have heard of them. Fair enough. The details immediately following, therefore, I'm afraid, you'll find even harder to accept, because amongst other things, they involve the information that you and you and you and me were killed in a violent, terrifying, and unprecedented manner more than a year ago. All of us were killed, which the subsequent course of this story will make perfectly clear and credible. But we're not there yet. Now, at first, you see, the miracles worked by Mr. Fotheringay for Mr. Maydig they were timid little things involving teacups and lace doilies, as feeble as the miracles of Theosophists. But after they'd worked a dozen or so of these domestic trivialities, the minister's imagination began to show signs of stimulation. His ambition swelled. Their first larger enterprise was due to hunger and the negligence of Mrs. Minchin, Mr. Maydig's housekeeper. Now, the meal to which the minister conducted Fotheringay certainly was poor refreshment for two industrious miracle workers, but they were already seated, and Mr. Maydig had been descanting for some time upon his housekeeper's shortcomings before it occurred to Fotheringay that here was an opportunity. Do you think, Mr. Maydig, he said, if it weren't a liberty, of course, I might... What? Oh, my dear Mr. Fotheringay, no, of course. No, not a liberty at all. Please, go ahead. What shall we have then? Said Mr. Fotheringay. And at Mr. Maydig's orders, he revised the supper very thoroughly. As for me, he said, eyeing Mr. Maydig's selection, I'm rather partial to a tankard of stout and a nice Welsh rarebit. I ain't much given to plovers' eggs, and forthwith stout and rarebit appeared at his command. Well, the two men sat long at their supper, talking of all the miracles that they would presently perform. And by the by, Mr. Maydig, I might perhaps be able to help you in a domestic way. Sorry? Don't quite follow you, said Mr. Maydig, sipping a glass of vintage Burgundy. Well, I was thinking I might be able to work a miracle with Mrs. Minchin herself. Make her a better woman. Oh, Mr. Fotheringay. No, I know she strongly objects to any interference, and I mean, it's past 11 o'clock. She'll probably be tucked up asleep. Well, I don't see that it shouldn't be done in a sleep. What? Really? Oh, yeah, go on. Very well, then. Go ahead.
Fotheringay issued his orders, and the two gentlemen proceeded with their repast. Mr. Daydig was just enlarging on the changes he might expect in his housekeeper the next day, when a series of confused noises came from upstairs. The minister left the room looking rather guilty, and Fotheringay heard his footsteps hurrying softly upstairs. But in a minute he returned, beaming. "Wonderful," he said, "and touching, most touching." He began pacing the hearthrug again. "A repentance, a most touching repentance through the crack in the door. Oh, a most wonderful change. She'd got up, poor woman. I mean, she must have got up at once. She'd got up out of her sleep to smash a secret bottle of brandy she kept in her box, and to confess it too. She confessed everything in the most penitent terms. My gosh, this opens up for us a most amazing vista of possibilities, Mr. Fotheringay. If we can work this change in Mrs. Minchin, the thing's unlimited," said Fotheringay. "And about Constable Winch, altogether unlimited," said Mr. Maydig, waving the Winch difficulty aside. And he proceeded to extemporize a series of marvellous plans. Now, the precise details of these plans are beyond my remit now. Suffice to say that they were designed in a spirit of infinite benevolence, and that there were the most astonishing changes. The small hours found Mr. Maydig and Fotheringay careering across the moonlit market square in an ecstasy of thaumaturgy. They reformed every drunkard in the parliamentary division. They changed all the beer and alcohol to water. Mr. Maydig had overruled Fotheringay on this point. They drained the local swamp. They improved the soil of One Tree Hill, cured the vicar's wart. They were just going to see what could be done with the injured pier at South Bridge when the church clock struck 3. "Oh, I say," said Fotheringay, pulling up short. "It's 3 o'clock. I'd best be getting back. I've got to be at work at 8. But we've only just begun," said Mr. Maydig. "Oh, Fotheringay, this is only the beginning. I think of all the good that we're doing when people wake up. No, I've got to get to work." Mr. Maydig gripped him by the arm, his eyes bright and wild. "My dear fellow, there's no hurry. Look." "What?" The minister pointed to the moon. "Joshua." "Joshua?" said Mr. Fotheringay. "Joshua. Why not stop it?" Fotheringay looked at the moon. "Stop that? Oh, Mr. Maydig, that's a bit tall, isn't it?" "Well, no, of course it doesn't stop. No, my dear fellow, no. You stop the rotation of the earth, you know. Time stops. Come on, it's not as if we're doing any harm." "Really?" said Fotheringay. "Oh, well, all right. Worth a try, I suppose. Here goes." He buttoned up his jacket and addressed himself to the habitable globe. Just stop rotating, will you?" The next sensation he was aware of was of flying head over heels through the air at the rate of dozens of miles a minute. And yet, in spite of the innumerable circles he was describing per second, he thought, for thought is a wonderful thing, he thought in a second and willed, "Let me come down safe and sound. Whatever else happens, let me be safe and sound." He willed it just in time, in fact, for his clothes, heated by his rapid flight through the air, were already beginning to smoulder. He came down with a forcible bump onto a mound of fresh-turned earth. A huge mass of metal and masonry, extraordinarily like the clock tower in the middle of the market square, hit the earth nearby, ricocheted over him, and flew into stonework and bricks and cement like an exploding bomb. A hurtling cow hit one of the larger blocks and smashed like an egg. There was a crash that made all the crashes of Fotheringay's past life seem like the sound of falling dust.
and this was followed by a descending series of lesser crashes. A vast wind roared through heaven and earth, and for a while Fotheringay was simply too breathless and too astonished to even see where he was. His first moment was to feel his head and reassure himself that his streaming hair was still his own. "What's wrong?" he squeaked. "Storms and thunder, and only a minute ago a fine night. My word, what a mess everything's in. Is Maydig sent me on this? Where is Maydig anyway? And where's the village? And where's anything?" Fotheringay struggled in vain to stand up in the violent wind, and after several failures remained on all fours, holding on. He surveyed the moonlit world to leeward, with the tails of his jacket flapping over his head. Far and wide, nothing was visible through the haze of dust that drove before a screaming gale. Nothing but tumbled masses of earth and heaps of meaningless ruins. No trees, no houses, no familiar shapes, only a wilderness of disorder vanishing into the darkness beneath the whirling columns of a gigantic storm. Near him was something that might once have been an elm tree, a smashed mass of splinters now, shivered from boughs to base. Further on, a twisted mass of metal girders, only too evidently the viaduct, rose out of this piled confusion. What had happened? Well, as I'm sure you have worked out for yourself, when Mr. Fotheringay had arrested the rotation of the solid globe, he'd made no stipulation concerning the trifling movables upon its surface. And the Earth spins so fast that the surface at its equator is travelling at rather more than 1,000 miles an hour, and in these latitudes at more than half that pace. Consequently, the village, the viaduct, Mr. Maydig, Fotheringay himself, everybody and everything, all of us, had been jerked violently forward at about 9 miles a second, and every human being, every mole and bumblebee, every house and every tree, all the world as we know it, had been smashed and utterly destroyed. Now, these things, of course, Fotheringay did not himself fully appreciate, but he perceived that his miracle had miscarried, and with that a great disgust of miracles came upon him. He was in darkness now, for the clouds had swept together and blotted out the moon, and the air was full of fitful, struggling wraiths of hail. A great roaring of wind and waters filled earth and sky, and peering under his hand, he saw by the play of lightnings a vast wall of water pouring towards him. His scream could not be heard amid the elemental uproar, yet scream to the advancing water he most certainly did. "Stop! For goodness sake, stop! Stop! Oh, what shall I do? God, what shall I do?" Then suddenly a moment of clarity. He remained on all fours, leaning against the wind, and said as calmly as he could, "Let nothing that I'm going to order to happen until I say off." He lifted his voice against the wind, shouting louder and louder in the vain desire to hear himself speak. "Now then, in the first place, what I've got to say is done. Let me lose my miraculous power. Let my will become just like anybody else's will, and all these dangerous miracles be stopped. I don't like them. That's the first thing. And the second is this. Let me go back to just before the miracles begin. Let everything be just as it was before that blessed lamp turned upside down. No more miracles. Everything as it was. Me back in the Long Dragon just before I drank my half pint." He dug his fingers into the earth, closed his eyes, and screamed, "Off!" Everything was perfectly still. Fotheringay perceived that he was standing upright, and he was indoors. "So you say," said a voice. He opened his eyes. He was in the bar of the Long Dragon, arguing about miracles with Toddy Beamish. He had a vague sense of some great thing forgotten. Because, of course, you see, except for the loss of his miraculous powers, everything was back as it had been. His mind and memory were just as they'd been at the time when this story began. So he knew absolutely nothing of what I have told you tonight. He still knows nothing to this day. And amongst other things, of course, he still did and does not believe in miracles. Yeah, I tell you that miracles, properly speaking, can't possibly happen, he said to Beamish. Whatever you like to hold. Yeah, that's what you think, said Toddy Beamish. Oh, all right, said Fotheringay, and took a sip of beer. Looky here, Mr. Beamish. Let us clearly understand what a miracle is. It's something contrariwise to the course of nature done by the power of will, yes? Etc., etc. The argument went along no particularly interesting lines, and there was no clear winner. And there we will, I think, do well to leave them. Thank you for your time.